On behalf of the Lutyens Trust America and the Lutyens Trust in the UK, I'd like to welcome you to this 14th webinar in our series on Sir Edwin Lutyens. Today we begin a conversation about Lutyens in India. This webinar will focus on Lutyens' role in the planning of New Delhi and will be followed by a webinar on Lutyens' architecture in India. Although Lutyens was perhaps not as well known for his planning as for his architecture, his work in this field is quite good. Just as Lutyens was able to visualize his buildings three-dimensionally as he designed, he was able to take that ability and apply it to planning so that he looked at the plan as a whole, fully realized piece that accounted for the required aspects of the plan. Today, Martin Lutyens will begin by discussing New Delhi in the context of Edwin Lutyens' overall body of work. Martin is the great nephew of Sir Edwin Lutyens, and we are very fortunate to have him as our chairman. Martin was born in India, educated at Eton College in England, and his various many visits back to India have helped him to develop a great love for the country. Our next panelist, Dhiru Thadani, currently resides in Washington, D.C., although he was born in India. Dhiru is an architect and urbanist who has been in practice since 1980. He has worked to disseminate principles and techniques of traditional town planning in all 5 continents by sharing research, lecturing, mentorship, and working on projects. He's been principal designer of new towns and cities, urban regeneration, neighborhood revitalization, academic campuses, and infill densification projects. Today, Dhiru will share with us some of his theories about the connectivity between Lutyens' design for New Delhi and the planning of other major capital cities such as Paris and Washington, D.C. In addition to being an architect and a planner, Dhiru is a gifted artist, so look for some of his sketches to turn up on his slides. Our final panelist is A.G. Krishna Menon. Professor Menon is an architect, an urban planner, a conservation consultant, and an academic based in New Delhi. In addition to his research and writing, Krishna has been actively involved with INTAC, the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage. Professor Menon will be sharing his insights into how the flexibility of Lutyens' plan for New Delhi has allowed New Delhi to function well as both an imperial city and as it transitioned and became a Republican city. Before I turn the webinar over to our panel, let me remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Lutyens Trust America YouTube channel and on our website. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll field the questions at the end as time permits. You can also email us through our website. I want to thank you for your continued support and engagement with these webinars. If you're enjoying them, please tell people about them. And we encourage you to join either the Lutyens Trust America or the Lutyens Trust in the UK. Our membership allows us to continue to look for new ways to look at Lutyens and to host these webinars. So Martin, I'll turn this over to you and share my screen.
All right, thank you very much, Robin. Right. Can you hear me, please, other members of the panel? Yeah, yes. Right. Yes. Okay, let's go. Look, I'm not actually one of your main speakers today, but although many of you will know quite a lot about Lutyens' early life and career, I thought for those who don't, it would be worth taking a few minutes to explain how this minimally educated young man became one of the most, if not the most celebrated British architect of his day. He was born in 1869. He had little conventional schooling, but at the age of 15, he joined the South Kensington School of Art in London, where incidentally he won a number of prizes. Following that, he spent a few months, no more than a few months, in the offices of Sir Ernest George, where he was an apprentice, Sir Ernest being a successful British architect of the time. In that office, he became friends with Herbert Baker, and that, of course, led later to his collaboration with Baker, and sadly, his falling out with him over Delhi. In 1889, he had his first serious commission for a country house, and the same year he set up his own business. Also, that same year, he met a quite extraordinary person, Gertrude Jekyll, who was skilled in all manner of arts and crafts, painting, writing, and above all, gardening and garden design. Lutyens learnt a huge amount from Gertrude Jekyll. They became close friends, and she indeed became his mentor. The house that's on your screen is the house that he designed for her in 1896, and it's a classic of its kind. It's built on arts and crafts principles using local materials and fine craftsmanship, but with the massive chimneys, the great sweeping roof, and those sort of streamlined gables, it couldn't possibly be old. And to this very day, it is a much sought after subject for study by architects and architectural students from all over the world. Around 1900, and through Gertrude Jekyll, Edwin met another key figure in his career, Edward Hudson, proprietor of Country Life. That was a magazine which published articles and photographs on country life and carried a whole series of photographs on Lutyens' houses, from the smaller ones to begin with, rising to the grander ones, such as this, which is Deanery Garden, built for Edward Hudson himself. Now, these two connections, Jekyll and Hudson, led to Lutyens' career taking off at a tremendous rate. And within a few years, he was looking for bigger work, office work, city planning, this type of thing. And in 1908 to 1909, he was appointed consultant architect to Hampstead Garden suburb, which you got on your screens now. This was his first venture into urban planning and public buildings. You can see the radiating streets, which were in feature of the design and not up to him. But in the center of the screen, you can see the Institute building. And in the foreground, to the left and the right, two other buildings. That's the Free Church and St. Jude's Church, which project forward from the Institute building. And it's always been in the back of my mind that this layout may have been a forerunner to Delhi, where you have the Viceroy's house, Rashtrapati Bhavan, and the two Secretariat buildings flanking it. Around the same time, he entered a competition, next slide please, for the headquarters for the London County Council. And he was absolutely disappointed beyond words not to win it. This is the building he designed, and although he didn't win, and that was a great disappointment, it did prove to the authorities that he was able to handle large and complex buildings. And so now, talking of large and complex buildings, I'm going to turn straight to Delhi, which the commission came shortly after the buildings that I've been describing. What you can see in front of you is what is now Rashtrapati Bhavan with the Jaipur column in front of it, photographed by E.E. Hall. It's part of a set of E.E. Hall photographs, which the Lutyens Trust has. E.E. Hall was Lutyens' assistant architect throughout the project from 1911 right through until it was complete in the 1930s. So at that point, I'd like to hand over to Dhiru, please, and ask him to continue.
Great. Well, I want to thank the Lutyens Trust, Robin and Martin, for this opportunity to share some of the ideas about planning of New Delhi and a couple of other capital cities. And, you know, an alternate title to this might be A Tale of Three Cities. I believe in lifelong learning, and the research I undertake is to enhance my understanding of architecture and urban design and incorporate this research into my professional work. My method of understanding is drawing, and most of this talk is illustrated, as Robin mentioned, with my drawings. Next slide, please. My thesis for this talk is threefold. One is to debunk the modernist idea that designers should break all connections with the past You cannot go forward if you do not know where you've been. The other is to communicate Leon Creer's definition of tradition. Tradition in architecture and planning is technology that works. We are free to use these ideas and absorb all that has worked in the past in our work. And for sure, we should reject failed ideas. Einstein said that insanity was repeating the same mistakes of the past and expecting a different result. And for the most part, the design profession have been doing just that, repeating some of the mistakes of the past. And my third intent is to show that Lutyens' plan for New Delhi fits into the continuum of planning history, and that it was and is very much of its time. You can think about the stork as playing ping pong on a triangular table with a timeline that I'm going to be showing you, and we'll be bouncing around 3 continents. So I'm going to start with this plan of Shah Jahan Bagh, which was built by Shah Jahan, whose capital was in Agra, but he felt compelled to have a capital in Delhi because that, in many ways, was the center of power. You might remember Shah Jahan for his building of the Taj Mahal for his beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal. I want to point out one aspect of this plan for Shah Jahan Bagh, which is the central axis that runs from the Red Fort. It's an east-west road. It's the widest road in that plan. And it runs from the Red Fort to the Fatehpuri Masjid. Now, this was 1 mile long, and it was one of the widest streets ever to be built in India. And it was used for processions, and it was also one of the greatest marketplaces. And the Mughal Empire was very proud of this street with 15,000 stores. Next slide, please. So while Shah Jahan Bagh was, important, the avenue was important in Shah Jahan Bagh, a few decades later, we see the building of this radiating avenues at Versailles by the Sun King, Louis XIV. The exorbitant palace is minuscule to the scale of the gardens. So here we see for the first time the gardens really being the focal point, and this large open spaces and radiating avenues. And the palace, which is actually very large, is minuscule here. Next slide, please. Now, a decade later, André Le Nôtre, who had been the landscape architect for Versailles, is commissioned to design the Tuileries. This was the kind of palace grounds for the emperors of France. And you can see that in the plan, the hatched area behind to the left, upper left corner, that's where the Tuileries, and André Le Nôtre is holding up his plan for the landscape. Next slide, please. Now, 4 decades later, this primary axis of the Tuileries is extended westward to the Place du Carrousel. So you can see that in the middle of the drawing, the actual plan for the Tuileries, the Place de Concorde became the Place de Concorde, and then the Place du Carrousel. So the axial was now extended just a little bit more past the Place de Concorde. Next, please. In 1777, the 23-year-old Charles Lafont, Pierre-Charles Lafont, travels to America to fight against the British alongside George Washington in the Revolutionary War. Back then, travel was very difficult. It took about 2 to 3 months, and it was all based on the trade winds, which I'm kind of diagramming in the map there. So it was quite a journey to come to America or to return. Next slide, please. Following the war, in 1783, now Major Pierre-Charles Lafont returns to Paris to see his father. At the very same time, the Montgolfier brothers are experimenting with hot air and laundry. It's every mother's nightmare to have their children play with laundry and fire. But that's what they were doing. And this led to the development of the hot air balloon. And a year later, in 1783, the same time that Lafayette was in Paris, they're offering tethered rides on the hot air balloon in the Tuileries. So you could go up in the Tuileries, go up about 100 feet, and then come back down for a price. The impact of seeing an aerial view of an axial condition within a city has had a profound impact on planning, especially grand plans for capital cities. Now, for the first time, the vision of the town planner can be appreciated from the sky. And this you can imagine it going from the medieval town plans, which were all experienced on the ground. Now that's completely changed because now you can appreciate it from a height, and in future years from flying, various different kinds of flying machines. Next slide, please. So Lafayette now returns to America, and a few years later, the American Congress declares that the new capital shall be built in the swampy, humid, muddy, and mosquito-infested site along the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia. Lafayette convinces Washington to give him the commission to design the capital. And you see Georgetown here on the left. That was the development already in existence. And it was there because it was where the Chesapeake, Ohio Canal emptied out, and they transferred goods, mostly tobacco, to the two boats that then took it on to Europe. Next slide, please. Now, Lafayette stays in Georgetown, and Georgetown is separated from the actual site itself, which was identified as a 10 square mile, 10 miles by 10 miles. And this is just a small fraction of that 10-mile square. And Lafayette places the capital in the middle of that 10-mile square. And he integrates the plan of Georgetown into the actual plan. And just to describe the plan briefly, you have an east-west mall running from Jenkins Hill, which holds the Capitol. And then you have a statue of George Washington in the middle of the plan, right there, and the president's house to the north. There's a canal. This land was very swampy, and the canal that exists there was still part of the plan. Next slide, please. So that, where did he get this dimension from? Where do you place? We could argue that the Jenkins Hill was there and the Potomac was there, and that's where he got the dimension. And the drawing on the left kind of shows what it might have been, what Lafayette imagined. It was the Capitol in the background, which didn't have its high dome at the time. And there was the equestrian statue of George Washington in the center, and then this kind of swampy ground. But that dimension between the equestrian statue and the face of the Capitol is the same as you see in Versailles on the top drawing, or you see in Paris in the next drawing, in the middle drawing, where the distance from the Louvre to the Place du Carrousel, that same dimension is consistent. And Lafayette, of course, was familiar with these dimensions and knew what these places. So, next slide, please. Now, back in Paris, they were offering these rides up and down in the Tuileries, and it's decided that the axis that had already been established is extended in 1800 to what now holds at the end of on the far west, the Arc de Triomphe. Next slide, please. So meanwhile, back in India in 1803, the vicious East India Company is waging war on Delhi to establish its stronghold on the country. Next slide. In Paris, the victorious Napoleon Bonaparte commissions the building of the Arc de Triomphe as a gateway to Paris for victory celebrations. And yeah, two images, one a panorama from that. Meanwhile, in America, the American Congress votes to build the Washington Monument where in lieu of that equestrian statue. And it's a much grander obelisk structure designed by Robert Mills, surrounded by tolos with various figures along. And as soon as they start building it in 1848, the swampy ground proves to be too unstable in the center. And the Army Corps of Engineers determines that the central location would not hold the 555-foot high obelisk. The location thus is moved 385 feet to the southwest. Work stops again as funds are not sufficient, and then work resumes 2 decades later. Next slide, please. Now, let's go back to Paris. With horse carriages as the major form of transportation in cities, the streets of Paris, medieval Paris, were filthy and not a very pleasant place for pedestrians. Napoleon III authorizes Baron Haussmann to clean up and beautify the city, which he does by demolishing 19,000 structures and rebuilding it by over 31,000 structures, all along grand boulevards, which he cuts through the medieval city, connecting all the major elements, monuments within the city and the civic buildings. And those streets, those avenues are lined by neoclassical buildings. So the Paris that we enjoy today is the act of authoritative violence and demolition, which you could never be able to do in this day and age. Next slide, please. While Haussmann is destroying the medieval fabric of Paris, the Mughals were making their last stand against the British in India. Bahadur Shah, the last Mughal, was arrested and he died in exile. So now the Brits are in control of India. Next slide, please. While Paris is being gutted for hygienic reasons, etc., and making it a cleaner, better living environment for people, a new concept of planning is being developed in England. Ebenezer Howard publishes his first book. He publishes several books with these amazing diagrams that talk about country and town living, the best of both worlds, as an antidote to the horrors of urban squalor. The Garden City movement, which is an urban planning concept, saw a city as a group of planned, self-contained communities surrounded by green belts containing proportionate areas of uses. Lutyens was well aware of Howard's work and was highly influenced by his work and agreed, and a lot of his work follows very much of this tradition. Next slide, please. Now, in 1900, a few years later, Lutyens is in Paris, overseeing his design for the 1900 exposition, and he admires the fortitude of Haussmann to reshape Paris. And here is a kind of collage drawing I made of Lutyens looking at it. You can see the dark yellow areas in the plan are areas that were destroyed and new buildings built and avenues put in their place. Next slide, please. Now, back in America, the swampy city of Washington is ready for a makeover. Senator McMillan forms a committee to rethink the public spaces of Washington and hires the best minds in the country to be part of this commission. So he hires Daniel Burnham, who had come off the 1893 City Beautiful Columbia Exposition in Chicago, Charles McKim, who was, let's say, the counterpoint to Lutyens in America. His firm did many, many public buildings in America, and Lutyens was clearly familiar with their work. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and the sculptor Augusta St. Gordon. So they, on this commission, they go for a boat ride on the Potomac River to look at the site, look at Washington from the river. And Burnham comes up with this great idea. Since it now got a little bit of their fee, he says, let's go for a 7-week study tour to Europe to study the best examples of public spaces. So it's pretty audacious, but this is where they go. They go to 8 different cities in Europe, spend 7 weeks, and then come back. And they're on a steamliner. They come back and they've got their plan for Washington, and the plan's released, the Macmillan plan. Next slide, please. Which is built upon not L'Enfant's plan, because L'Enfant only lasted as the planner for Washington for 11 months. They give the plan to Andrew Ellicott, who's a surveyor, and he basically value engineers it, and he takes up all the cranks and all the kind of nuances that Lafayette had in his plan. So this is the plan that was being followed. And it's really the Ellicott plan. Next slide, please. And the Macmillan Commission, Macmillan plan does an axis and cross axis. And they make a new center around the Washington Monument. It's not in the center, it's off to the side, but they extend the mall to the west and they extend the mall to the south. And that becomes a future site for the Lincoln and Jefferson memorials. So you wonder, how far should they extend this mall? Next slide, please. They've been to Paris. And the question is, they now take the very same dimension that from Place du Carrousel to the Arc de Triomphe, they take that very same dimension and they reuse it to extend the mall to the Lincoln Memorial. Now, they're reclaiming land in the water in the Potomac so they could go as far or as less as they wanted, but they choose exactly that same dimension. And the dimension doesn't align as the lines go, but it's the same dimension between the Washington Monument, which is 385 feet to the east, and the face of the Lincoln Memorial. So they replicate that dimension that they had just seen in Paris. Next slide, please. So, like all the rulers before the British, Delhi is perceived as the center of power, and the British decide to relocate the capital from Calcutta to Delhi. Next slide, please. Lutyens is commissioned to design the new capital city, which is the eighth conquered city development in Delhi. Shah Jahan was the seventh, New Delhi the eighth. Here's this, again, speculative drawing of Lutyens with the site plan. And I show it with a screen from Fatehpur Sikri, the mosque in Fatehpur Sikri, which he was aware of, and the hexagon design in that screen work, the Mughal screen work. Next slide, please. So I want to just talk a little bit about the site context. The map on the left shows you the 7 other developments. Number 7 on the top is Shah Jahan, and number 8 is Lutyens site, 5 and 6, which he incorporates the other 2 developments. The actual drawing on the right, I just took all the various monuments that were preserved from 1911, and they're all shown on the site. And what you have on the left is the ridgeline and Ricina Hill, and on the right side, you have the Yamuna River. Next slide, please. So the first thing he does is establish the Cardo and Documanus, the east-west axis and the north-south axis, and sort of very carefully places that in the plan, avoiding the various monuments that were in existence. Next slide, please. My analysis, I like to think is the 7 hexagons that he places on it. There are many, many interpretations of the geometry and the various proportional systems that Lutyens uses, but I'm going to go with this one. So there's 7 hexagons based on the site that set up the framework plan. Next slide. He then superimposes a triangle on the hexagons going from the center. It's an equilateral triangle going from the 2 centers. Next slide, please. And he establishes a location for the Viceroy's Palace on the west and the commercial center, the 2 kind of centers of power on the top of that pyramid. So it's a little outside of the hexagon plan. Next. And here are the tertiary and secondary streets that fall in. Next slide. And these are some of the buildings that he proposed in the very early stages of the plan. Not all of them were built, but you kind of start to see his idea of this King's Way, what they call the King's Way, which then became Rajpath, with the Viceroy's Palace in the center on the west. Next slide. This is just another analysis that shows that it's two overlapping hexagons and a rectangular bar that's King's Way slicing through them. Next. want to point out that Lord Hardinge, who was part of the design team or overseeing the Capitol, the design of the Capitol, had served in Washington, and so he was very familiar with Washington. And he also loved Paris, and so he encouraged Lutyens to look at both these cities, which Lutyens already was doing, but nonetheless, Lord Hardinge was familiar with these two. Now, when you look at that dimension again in New Delhi, to the base of the Secretariat building, that dimension again has a coincidence with the dimension of Washington, La France distance, Paris, Versailles, the same exact dimension, around 1.35 to 1.4 miles, within a few hundred feet. And that's where he places it. And then the Viceroy's Palace is a route 2 dimension, 1.42 over to the west. Next slide, please. So these could all be coincidences, or they could really be folks looking at each one of these plans. Now, when we look at the comparison of these three plans, you've got Paris on top, and you start to see at one end was the Louvre and the Arc de Triomphe. So you've got, so it starts off with Imperial and a War Memorial. In Washington, it's Congress and the founders in the middle, Washington and Memorial to Washington, and then Lincoln is on the west, and of course, he's a profound president who kind of reinforced the Constitution that all men are created equal. And then in Delhi, you've got Imperial and a War Memorial. So there are some similarities of what happens in these, what's placed on either end of these axes. Next slide, please. I do want to show the Lincoln Memorial, which was the new element that was added by the Macmillan Plan on the west side, and there was a design competition to do the Lincoln Memorial. Again, Lutyens is familiar with the competition, and and it's all the work of some of the most famous architects in America is published, so he's well aware of this. Next slide. I want to show you that the everlasting memory of this really wonderful memorial. This is a place chosen just a few months ago, the day before the inauguration of President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. They chose this location to have the COVID-19 memorial ceremony. And they placed 400 lights as in honor of the 400, or in memory of the 400,000 victims of the deadly disease. And it just shows the power of these beautiful public spaces and how, even 100 years later, how valuable they are and moving they are to everyone. Next slide, please. Now, these architects and planners did not only learn from the plan dimension, the horizontal dimensions, they also learned from the vertical dimension. And one of the things that is noteworthy is that what they understood from the the Arc de Triomphe is that the vertical dimension is necessary, high enough, so that the horizontal, so that you can see it from a distance of 2 miles or so. Next slide, please. So they learned from presidents. Here's a speculative drawing. Lutyens comes to Washington. He's, as I said, he was familiar with the plan, and he comes to receive the AIA Gold Medal in 1925. And this drawing kind of shows him at the Hay Adams Hotel with the White House behind and the memorial behind that. Next slide, please. In 1931, the inauguration of New Delhi, and you can see all the kind of famous buildings in the plan, including the Kila, the Purana Kila on the upper left one, which is one of the fortresses that was saved, historic fortresses that was saved as part of the plan. Next slide. And Connaught Circle, the commercial center, is completed in 1933. And it's really the antithesis to the Indian market. I mean, it's clean, it's very geometric form. I also think it's, highly inspired by the diagrams of Ebenezer Howard. and these white two-story buildings is really very different from the Indian market. Next slide, please. And I want to end with this view of the Rajpath right after independence, and these two images showing it being occupied by the Indian population celebrating Independence Day, and it's always used on Republic Day as a great celebratory space. And I hope that I've made the case that Lutyens' plan for New Delhi very much fits into the continuum of planning history. And for that reason and many others, it should be preserved or added to with utmost care and respect. And now I'd hand it over to Krishna Menon, who will continue the story. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the Lutyens Trust for inviting me to give this talk. Next slide, please. My purpose is to look at Lutyens' Delhi and say that you can see it through two lenses. One lens we have already seen through, that is Dhiru has shown us as a part of Lutyens' corpus of works and evaluated it in the context of the prevailing issues in architecture and urban planning. That's one way of understanding Lutyens' Delhi. The second is to see it as a narrative of the development of Delhi, which is what I will be focusing on. How did this plan, how was it accommodated? How did it fit in? How did it serve the Delhi we know today? And I will end up by showing that really both these narratives, the narrative that Dhiru has recounted and the narrative that I propose to give, show that they illuminate the genius of Lutyens. So that will be the rough purpose of my talk. Next. We already spoke about these 7, 8 cities. Some historians say more, but 8 cities certainly. The 8th was Lutyens' Delhi. 7th was Shahjahanabad. And I wanted to emphasize the fact that there is something called the aura of Delhi. All the various rulers for 1,000 years built the capitals here. Somehow the idea was that unless you ruled from Delhi, you did not rule at least North India. The North Indian area had the capitals here. And in a way, that aura may have also influenced the British to build a new capital here. Because after all, Shah Jahan did not have to build a capital here. He was ruling quite comfortably the largest empire of his time from Agra and Lahore. But he built a new capital in Delhi called Shahjahanabad. And similarly, the British, they were ruling the largest empire in the world from Calcutta, didn't have to build a new capital in Delhi. But I feel, and this is the argument I'm making, the aura of Delhi attracted both, and both felt compelled to build new capitals here. And both these capitals made enormous advances in town planning. This is Shahjahanabad, which Dhiru has already spoken about. It advanced the ideas of town planning at that time, introduced that long linear Chandni Chowk and monuments, and it was by the Yamuna River, and it was within this triangle of between the ridge and the river, which contained the aura of a new capital. And the contemporary sources say this was as big a capital as Beijing or Edo or other capitals of the time, and was as splendid. It had monuments, it had wide streets, it had buildings. Next. And similarly, New Delhi, when it was located, and we have discussed the plan of New Delhi, I will not be discussing it, but here it is between the ridge and the river, in the center of this triangle, which is emblematic of the aura of Delhi. And it contained at that time, it reflected at that time two important city planning movements, which are the City Beautiful movement and the Garden City movement. The City Beautiful movement, which is associated with Daniel Burnham, talked about grand cities, and here's the grand city. And the Garden City movement, it's a verdant and green city, is also the two influential ideas of town planning that Lutyens managed to combine. Next. And it really contained the central axis, which was the central vista, and the hexagonal or triangular streets, and the geometry, and within that was all the residential neighborhoods. So the morphology was important, and this morphology is what is significant about this city. Next. It contained magnificent buildings, Rashtrapati Bhavan, next, and other important buildings, next. The India Gate on one side and Rashtrapati Bhavan on the other. Next. And other important buildings like the North and South blocks, which are the Secretariat buildings. And they all captured the spirit of Delhi by using the stone that is used by the Mughals, the red and the beige sandstone, which are used here. So the association of trying to capture the aura, capture the reputation of being the rulers of India is very much evident both in the planning and in the architecture. And there's the Parliament building and the Connaught Place. Next. And other princely estates, very large buildings. This is the Hyderabad House, which is now the State Guest House, Jaipur House, which is the Museum of Modern Art, and the Baroda House, which is the headquarters of the Northern Railways, and the other princely buildings around. So it was a grand plan with grand buildings. Next. And along with it were the bungalows. The bungalows were in large estates, and now it is known as the Lutyens Bungalow Zone. And it's ironic because none of the bungalows were designed by Lutyens. He did design 4 bungalows in the president's estate, in the viceroy's estate. But these bungalows were designed by other architects. But this area, ironically, is still called the Lutyens Bungalow Zone. Next. So at that time, when the New Delhi was completed, a plan of 1940 shows the layout of Delhi with the area marked, which is the Imperial Delhi. And the area was really administered by the Delhi Improvement Trust. The reason I'm showing it is that ever since then, the Imperial Delhi designed by Lutyens was always administered differently. The rest of the Delhi was administered by the Delhi Improvement Trust. The New Delhi area was administered by the federal government. And to the southwest, you can see the cantonment. The cantonment is also a separate administered area by the military. So this area is the Delhi Improvement Trust. And next slide shows in 1947, the population of Delhi was 700,000. Lutyens designed New Delhi for a population of 50,000. In 1951, the area of the city had increased to 1,400,000, and 1961, 2,283,000. So obviously, because of the partition, the population increased, planning became a mess, the area was full of ad hoc additions. So the government decided to have a planned development of the city, and in 1957 created the Delhi Development Authority, which was tasked to make the master plan of Delhi. So in 1962, the master plan of Delhi was adopted. This was made by through the courtesy of Ford Foundation, who hired 4 American planners to make the master plan of Delhi, which really is the first master plan of Delhi, the 1962 to 1980 master plan, in which the population they expected was about 5 million by 1980. But the original Lutyens area still was administered by the center. The green shows what was designed by Lutyens. The red shows how it's been tweaked, how it was added on and deleted. The area on top was deleted, the Connaught Place area, because the master plan made Connaught Place the central business district of Delhi and a central business district of a huge city like 5 million. Obviously, a lot of other developments came, and it soon lost the character of the imperial city. So that was carved out, and additional areas are made by adding the ridge and some contiguous areas. But the central vista and the geometric layout and all that remained, and this continues to be the original Lutyens Delhi. Next. Now, this has always been well mentored. Several reports of the government have defined how this area should be looked at, administered. In 1974, the New Delhi Development Advisory Committee made a report saying that these things should be, this is how the imperial city should be developed. In 1988, the concept of the LBZ was introduced. The Lutyens Bungalow Zone was given with the guidelines of the development within that area. And in the 2021 master plan, that's the third master plan, the 1980 to 2021 master plan, declared the LBZ area as a heritage zone. So over the years, this area has been looked at, and by 2001, it was declared an official heritage zone. Next. So this is that official heritage zone, removing Connaught Place from the original plan, but the rest of the features are still there. The central vista, the street layouts, and all the other monuments, which are protected monuments in there. Next. But as I said, the Connaught Place had changed its character. High-rise buildings came up, though the Connaught Place building itself was a heritage building that was preserved, but developments around changed the character of that area. Next. And within the bungalow zone also, development started taking place. New buildings came up, memorials or office buildings came up, not changing the character drastically, but certainly altering it. Next. And outside the imperial city, much bigger developments started coming up. So what it resulted was that Lutyens Bungalow Zone became what Norma Evans, the historian, called a donut plan. There was a high density around and low density inside. Now that was the character of the city, but that also created the problems of the city, because seeing an empty piece of land in the middle of the city is always attraction for politicians and developers to attack it. Next. But the area was declared a heritage zone. Very little development could take place, or under very controlled area it could be taken up. And this area was also administered by the New Delhi Municipal Committee, which was administered by the federal government. Next. But sufficient character remained for us in 2014 to nominate it as a World Heritage Site. In spite of the fact that a lot of development had taken place, we were able to show that the integrity of the plan that Lutyens designed and the character of the city still was there, enough for us to nominate it as a World Heritage Site. And it would perhaps have become a World Heritage Site had not the new government decided to withdraw the nomination. And so that never got through. The government was concerned about the fact that once it's declared a World Heritage Site, no development could take place here. And so this is where the matter stands, that it was sufficient enough to become a World Heritage Site, but it never got the tag. Next. So what remains as that significant heritage we're talking about is the central vista, which is in red, all the major morphology of the streets, and Connaught Place. So these areas are still there, and hence the significance of the design of the city is still visible and experienced. Next. So as you can see, the central vista is still the same central vista, in spite of all the developments that have taken place both within the residential area and outside. So it gave us sufficient cause to reason to nominate as a World Heritage Site. Next. And as Dhiru mentioned, after 1947, this imperial space became a public space. People became a major public area of Delhi. Next. This is where people came for recreation. It became a people's place for selfies and for boating and for ice creams, and all the recreational activities started taking place. So this is how an imperial city became a very democratic and very republican city. So next. But the development still is an issue. And this is look at what is proposed. This is a model of a development that's going to take place. It's under construction right now. It shows the central vista and new buildings coming up. The heritage buildings will remain. The Rashtrapati Bhavan, the North Block, South Block, the Parliament building, and the archives building designed by Lutyens will remain. Other new buildings will come up. Next. So another view of that proposed development. Next. A more detailed view of the development. And I'm showing you the bottom two to show that the same central vista view is there, though the scale is slightly different. The buildings on the side are much larger. We can complain about the fact that the detailed values are being compromised, but the overall scheme is still the same. Next. So in conclusion, what I want to say is that in the 7 decades since independence, the LBZ area, the Lutyens Bungalow Zone area, has been contested for 2 major reasons. One is it is perceived to be an underutilization of valuable land. Of course, there are other reasons why it should remain: environmental reasons, climatic reasons, and the beauty reasons, and the reason for aura. The fact that it finally, the capital of India is still has got that aura of the capital that Lutyens conceived. And the second part is that the difficulty of engaging with an imperial legacy. Remember, in a democracy, you've got all kinds of views, and people object to the fact that it's an imperial capital. And so these 2 reasons have been something that has been contested. However, what I'm showing is that the significance, the essential character has been preserved to enable it to be nominated as a UNESCO World Heritage City. And the current development must be seen as a continuing dialogue. So I want to end up by recounting what quotation, and I think an apocryphal statement made by William Morris, who once was asked, why do you conserve? What do you conserve? And he said, you conserve what 2 people can argue about. And my point is that Delhi is a wonderful example of what 2 people can argue about and still retain the significance. So that is the testimony of the genius of Lutyens, because it offers another perspective to evaluate his work, and it offers the reason why we must argue about it, why we must conserve it, and even as it changes, how the significance can still be maintained. Thank you.
Well,
At this point, I'll
thank
turn
you very
it over to
much
questions.
indeed, Krishna and Dhiru. 2 really interesting and excellent presentations. And it's comforting to see that in spite of present developments, the core of Lutyens' work is still there. I'd like to ask Patrick Verthio, please, to invite questions. The questions are already in front of him, I think, so if he could field some of them and feed them out to our speakers, that would be helpful.
Yes, thank you both for your presentations, and just want to remind everyone that if you do have any questions, please write them in the question and answer tab at the bottom of your screen. The first question we have is from Ewan Easton, and asking, what makes a bungalow a bungalow? I'm intrigued to see all those illustrated appear to be arranged over more than one floor.
A bungalow is a residential building, 1-story residential building in a large plot of land. It sort of is something that you can say it's a plotted development. In a large plot, you have one building, that's a bungalow. Bungalow has a history in India, the independent buildings. So this name continued as a bungalow, and it's called the Bungalow Zone because there were about 1,000 bungalows built in this area. And most of those 1,000 bungalows are still there. It's occupied by government officers, and some of them are private, but they're supposed to remain as bungalows, but it's under tremendous pressure to develop, become multi-storied. And that is the debate, how to densify while still retaining the character.
Yeah, I think even the question, I think looking at the photographs, you think they're more than one story. I think that's what your question was about. But most of those buildings have tall ceilings. So though they have a chhaja or a overhang at the one-story level, they go above, because a lot of them have central rooms, at least the ones that I've visited, have central rooms which are about 1.5 stories high with clear story lights around, and then the rooms that flanks, it's almost like a courtyard which is enclosed, and then it's flanked by rooms around that are lower ceilings. So they have, sometimes in elevations, they appear like they're more than one story.
Thank you. Our next question is from Michael Ray, asking, was Lutyens established enough as an architect in order to serve as a London host to the Macmillan 7-week tour group?
Well, I don't really know exactly whether they met, but I'm assuming that they did meet, because he was visiting London and really looking at, they were looking at public spaces in England, and they visited a lot of, a lot of famous sites. And I don't have the full itinerary of that, but I'm sure there's historians who have more details about all the 8 places that, and what buildings, etc., and who hosted them, at the time. But it is true that Lutyens did know the work of McKim, because he did make a joke about when he arrived in New York for the first time. He made a joke about whether this was the Grand Railroad station that McKim had done. Of course, he was well aware of Penn Station, McKim's Penn Station, which was one of the grandest railroads. But he played that kind of joke on his host, thinking that, well, I'm confused, so.
Thank you. Another question here from Paul Gunther is, what is the present population of New Delhi, and what number is foreseen in 20 years?
Dhiru, would you like to?
Well, it's like, what, I think it's 20 million right now? Would you say
Yeah, well,
that?
it's 20 million. Right now it's about 20 million.
20 million.
And if you consider the surrounding areas, the other, it goes to 45 million.
Yeah.
And there's all a contiguous city. The national capital itself is a territory which is got boundaries, but that will be about 20 million. But there's several other contiguous cities that they live together organically, so they function organically. So it could be much larger configuration.
I think Delhi in that sense rivals Beijing in terms of the spread, though Beijing has all the ring roads. Delhi does not, so it's all a spider web. Everything comes to the middle, and hence you get a lot of congestion. But they are building, and they have built the metro station, which really helps, the metro lines, which really helps with some of that congestion. Hello, Paul. I recognize Paul. What's the next question?
Yes. The next question here is from Charles Lutyens. With the massive buildings constructed along the Raj Path, will the areas used by the public for recreation purpose be compromised? I think in that new proposal.
Yes, I think that is our complaint, that while the looks of the Rajpath may remain approximately the same, its spirit will go. Because what we saw was it was a very public place. But with all the government offices coming and with security concerns, it will become like a gated government enclave where people will not be as free to move around and loiter and enjoy themselves. But the space will still be there. So that is one thing that we've been complaining about, that these developments at one level seem to respect, but another level lose the spirit of the space.
Yeah, it's pretty unfortunate that a public space will no longer be public.
Yes.
Maybe time for one last question here from Azam Rashid. What are your views on conserving a heritage which does not have belongingness? in that last part is in quotes.
You see, we get into a lot of other issues here about what is heritage. Because as the politics of the world is moving, it's becoming more nationalistic. Whereas the liberal view that heritage is really something that you've accumulated over centuries, that is heritage, is losing out. So it will be difficult to say that a heritage belongs to someone else. It belongs to us today. So whoever built it, whoever occupied it earlier, but today it belongs to us. So that is heritage. Now that idea is being contested. When we say it is a colonial heritage, an Islamic heritage, a Hindu heritage, or Buddhist heritage, when it becomes like that, it becomes a problem. And part of it also, I would say, is part of the problem of British historiography. When they wrote the history of India, they compartmentalized it into these periods. And that has somehow got embedded, and today it is manifesting itself into this period.
Excuse me, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm afraid for the last 5 minutes I've been without any sound at this end, so I'm very cross to have missed that interesting interchange. But I think we have come to the end of our allotted time, and excuse me not being able to hear, but this is to say thank you very, very much indeed to Krishna and Dhiru for their wonderful presentation and talk, and to Patrick for fielding the questions, even if I couldn't hear them, and to Robin for organizing the program in the first place. And I do hope that everybody who's been on this webinar has enjoyed it. Please keep an eye open for our next ones. The next one will be in about a month's time. And if you're not already members of the Lutyens Trust America or the Lutyens Trust in the UK, do please consider joining us. We'd love to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.